Have you ever wondered why sometimes it feels like God is taking everything away from your life? The job, the friends, the stability, even the peace you felt before. Suddenly everything falls apart and you start to wonder, what did I do wrong? Or worse, has God abandoned me? But what if I told you that this moment of loss is not the end, but the beginning of something much bigger? That, behind every closed door, there is a purpose that you still cannot see. Many people go through this and despair without realizing that God never works without a plan. If He is allowing you to miss something, it is because He is preparing something much greater. But are you ready to understand what God is doing? The truth is that the pain of loss makes us question everything. You pray, ask for answers, cry out, but instead of a solution, what you receive is silence. Despair takes over, and doubt begins to whisper in your heart. Why is God allowing this? But before you think that He has forgotten I want you to understand one thing. God never takes anything without a purpose. He never allows losses without a fresh start prepared for you. And what I'm going to show you today can completely change the way you see these difficult moments. And don't think that this only happens to you. The Bible is full of stories of people who had to lose everything before experiencing the extraordinary. Job lost his family, his wealth, his health, but in the end, God gave him double. Joseph was betrayed, thrown into prison, but later became governor of Egypt. David spent years on the run in the desert before becoming king. God always works like this because He knows that transformation only happens in the middle of the process. What seems like destruction can actually be the construction of something much greater. But for that, you need to trust. And now I ask you, have you ever had a time when you felt like God was taking everything from you? How was this experience? What did you learn from this? Leave your comment below, because your story can strengthen the faith of someone who is going through the same desert right now. And before continuing, I need you to do something very important. Like this video and subscribe to the channel. This is not just a request. It is a way of spreading this message to more people who need to hear this truth. What comes next may open your eyes to something you never noticed before. Are you ready to understand what God wants to teach you? So stay with me, because now you will discover the real answer behind the losses that seem to make no sense. But before continuing, I need to tell you something very serious. We are living in decisive times, and what is happening in your life may be much more than a simple moment of crisis. If God is allowing certain things to get out of your control, it may be because He is calling you to something much greater. But you need to be careful, because many ignore this call and end up moving away at a time when they should be getting even closer to God. The Bible warns us about the signs of the end times, about how many trials would come to shape us and prepare us for something that is to come. We cannot be blind to what is happening around us. God is speaking, and we need to be sensitive to His voice. Do you think these losses in your life are by chance? Do you think what you are facing right now doesn't have a greater purpose? The world is changing, and if you are not firm in your faith, you may end up being carried away by the storms of life. Therefore, I make an important request of you. Like this video right now and subscribe to the channel. It's not just a click, it's an act of faith. It's a way to take this message to more people who are desperate, without knowing that God still has a perfect plan for them. If you believe that this truth needs to reach more lives, be part of this mission. Share this video, leave your comment, and help spread the word before it's too late. Now stick with me, because what comes next might be the answer you've been waiting for. You will understand why God allows certain things to be removed from your life, and how this can be the beginning of something that will completely transform your story. Everything seemed to be going well, until suddenly everything started to fall apart. First, it was the little things, those subtle signs that something was changing, but seemed too insignificant to take seriously. Then the problems came, like an avalanche, one after the other, with no time to breathe. The job, which was once stable, was lost. Bills started piling up. The family, which seemed united, was now filled with conflicts and disagreements. His health began to fail. Fatigue took over. And in the midst of this chaos, a single question echoed in the mind. Why? Why is this happening? Why all at once? Why is God allowing this? Where is He when I need it most? These are questions that come like arrows, hitting straight to the heart, leaving the feeling that God has moved away, that He has forgotten, that He simply chose not to listen to prayers. It is in these moments that faith begins to waver. You pray, you cry, you seek answers, but it seems like all you get back is silence. The sky seems closed, desperation sets in, and suddenly that God that you always believed took care of everything seems distant, inaccessible, silent. Maybe you're going through exactly this right now. Maybe your life has been turned upside down without warning. Maybe you're trying to understand why God is allowing everything around you to fall apart. And the hardest thing is that no one has answers. People tell you to have faith, to keep praying, but inside you wonder if it's still worth it. If God really is in control, why doesn't He just stop the pain? Why doesn't He give relief? Why doesn't He respond? And it is exactly at this point that many get lost, because when the pain is too strong and the answer doesn't come, doubt sets in. The enemy begins to whisper lies, saying that God has forgotten you, that He doesn't care, that you are alone in this battle. You begin to look around and see people who don't even seek God, but who seem to be thriving, while you, who are trying to be faithful, are facing the biggest struggles of your life. You start to wonder if it's really worth trusting, if God is really listening, if He is really there. But what if I told you that God's silence is not a punishment but a plan? What if I told you that God allows certain losses not to destroy you, but to prepare you for something greater? Because the truth is that God never works without a purpose. When He allows everything to be uprooted, it is because He is building something much greater. But the question is, can you trust Him even without understanding what is happening? The Bible is full of examples of people who went through exactly this. People who faced devastating losses before experiencing the extraordinary. Good, he lost everything, his family, his health, his wealth, and yet he remained faithful. Joseph, he was betrayed, sold into slavery, unjustly imprisoned before being exalted as governor of Egypt. David, he was anointed king, but before sitting on the throne, he had to spend years on the run, living in the desert, facing persecution. And they all had a moment when they might have thought exactly as you are thinking now. God has abandoned me. But what happened next proved that God had never turned away. He was just preparing something that went far beyond what they could imagine. And maybe that's what God is doing with you right now. Maybe you are looking at the losses, the problems, the closed doors, without realizing that God is moving the pieces on the board, behind the scenes. You may not understand now, but that doesn't mean He isn't acting. God never destroys without the intention of rebuilding. But in order for Him to take you to the next level, He needs to remove everything that is not part of the plan He has for you. And now I want to ask you something very important. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like God was taking everything away, but then you realized He was just preparing you for something bigger? If so, share your testimony in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone needs to hear to not give up now. But before we continue, I need to ask you something. If this message is speaking to your heart, if you believe that more people need to hear this truth, then like this video and subscribe to the channel right now. This isn't just a click, it's a leap of faith. It's a way to spread this word to more people who, like you, may need to understand that God's silence never means abandonment. Now, stay with me, because in the next moment, you will discover exactly why God allows certain losses and how this can be the beginning of the greatest new beginning of your life. We can't always understand God's ways when we are going through pain, When everything seems to fall apart, our first reaction is to question, to doubt, to feel that God has moved away. But the truth is that God is never absent. It just works in ways that we often can't immediately perceive. Human logic teaches us that losing is something negative, that it means failure, that it is the end of the line. But in God's logic, loss can be the beginning of something much greater. What appears to be destruction may be a divine realignment, a preparation for something we cannot yet see. And if we look at the scriptures, we see that this pattern repeats itself countless times. God never takes someone to a higher level without first molding them in the fire of trial. Think about Job. He was a man of integrity, faithful to God, someone who had everything: family, wealth, health, respect. But suddenly everything was taken away. In a single day, he lost his children, his wealth, his health, and even the support of his wife, who encouraged him to give up and curse God. His friends, instead of consoling him, suggested that he must have committed some sin to suffer like that. Job found himself alone, surrounded only by silence and pain. But at no point did he abandon his faith. He questioned, yes. He cried, yes. But he remained steadfast because he knew God had a purpose, even if he couldn't understand it. And in the end, God restored everything Job had lost, giving him twice as much as he had before. But would Job have had his faith strengthened? In the same way, if he had never gone through the desert of loss. Another powerful example is Joseph of Egypt, a young man who had big dreams, who received a promise from God, but who, before seeing that promise come true, was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, unjustly accused and thrown into prison. To human eyes, his story looked like a complete failure. How could someone who received a vision of greatness from God end up in this situation? But God was preparing something. Every painful step of Joseph's journey was part of the divine plan. If he had not been sold, he would not have gone to Egypt. If he hadn't been arrested, he wouldn't have interpreted Pharaoh's dream. And if that hadn't happened, he would never have become governor of Egypt and saved thousands of lives, including his own families. What looked like destruction was, in fact, God's strategic path. David also went through the process of loss before being exalted. He was anointed king at a young age, but instead of being crowned immediately, he had to spend years fleeing from Saul, facing deserts, trials, and persecution. Why didn't God just allow him to take the throne soon? Because David still needed to be prepared. He needed to learn to trust God in hiding, to develop resistance, to mature before carrying the crown. God never delivers a great mission without first preparing the person who will carry it out. And this is where many fail in the walk of faith. When God allows loss, most people despair and give up, not realizing that they are in the middle of the process, not at the end of the story. They cling to what they have lost and cannot see what God is preparing. But have you ever stopped to think that God may be allowing certain losses in your life because He has something much bigger to give you? That He may be taking away what holds you back to make way for something that is truly part of your purpose? God does not work randomly. He does not allow you to lose something if that loss is not essential to your growth. But the big question is, do you trust enough to continue believing, even without understanding? Can you look beyond the pain and realize that God is shaping you for something much greater? And now I ask you, have you ever been in a situation where you thought everything was lost, but then you realized that God was preparing you for something much bigger? Share in the comments, because your story could be exactly what someone needs to hear so they don't give up now. And before continuing, I need to ask you something very important. If this message is speaking to you, if you believe that other people need to hear this too, then like this video and subscribe to the channel right now. This isn't just a click, it's a leap of faith. It's a way to spread this word to more people who, like you, may need to understand that loss is never the end when God is in control. Now, stay with me, because what comes next could completely change the way you see difficult moments in your life. you will understand how God uses the desert as a training ground for those he wants to exalt. The desert is a place of solitude, scarcity, silence, a place where everything that once seemed certain now becomes uncertain. It's where you feel without direction, without answers, without support. And it is exactly in this place that God works most. Many people believe that being in the desert means being far from God, that going through difficulties is a punishment. But what if I told you that the desert was never a place of abandonment, but rather of transformation? That God didn't take you into this process to destroy you, but to prepare you. In the Bible, the desert has always been a place where God shaped his chosen ones before fulfilling great promises. It was in the desert that Moses spent 40 years before being called to free the people from Egypt. It was in the desert that the people of Israel needed to cross to leave slavery behind and learn to trust in God. It was in the desert that Jesus spent 40 days being tested before beginning his ministry. The desert is not a mistake on the way. The desert is part of the plan. And why does God allow us to go through the desert? Because it is there that we are taught to depend completely on him. When everything is fine, when we have everything we need, it's easy to trust. But when the ground disappears, when the doors close, when we feel alone, that's when our faith is truly tested. God allows certain things to be taken away because he wants to teach us something greater. He wants to teach us to trust, even without understanding. He wants to teach us to obey, even without seeing the way. He wants to teach us to wait, even when it seems like nothing is happening. And the biggest mistake that many people make in the desert is trying to get out of it too soon. The people of Israel should have crossed the desert in a few days, but it took 40 years because they didn't know how to trust. They murmured, they doubted, they rebelled against God. And because of this, many of them never reached the promised land. They saw the miracles. They were fed by God every day, but they still chose to look at the difficulties rather than the promise. Doesn't this still happen today? How many times is God sustaining us in the middle of the desert, but we choose to focus on what is missing instead of focusing on what he is already doing? God uses the desert to shape us. It breaks pride. He teaches us to listen to his voice. He strengthens us for what comes next. Jose had to go through prison before reaching the palace. David had to go through the desert before becoming king. Job had to lose everything before being restored. And you? Could it be that this difficult time you're facing right now is not exactly the training that God is using to prepare you for something greater? The big question is, how are you reacting to your desert? Are you trusting, or are you murmuring? Are you learning, or are you just complaining? God doesn't want to leave you in this place forever, but he will only take you out when you are ready. The desert has a purpose, but it's up to you to decide whether you're going to go through it learning and growing, or whether you're going to wander around like the people of Israel, postponing the promise that is already prepared for you. Now I want to hear from you. What was the biggest learning you've ever had during a difficult time? Have you ever noticed that God used a moment of scarcity to teach you something? Leave your comment, because your testimony can strengthen the faith of someone who is going through the desert right now. And before we continue, I need to ask you something very important. If this word is speaking to your heart, if you believe that more people need to understand this truth, then like this video and subscribe to the channel right now. This isn't just a click. It's a way of taking this message to more people who need to understand that God never abandons us, even when everything seems to fall apart. Now, stay with me, because what comes next could completely change the way you see the challenges that God allows in your life. You will understand how each trial can be the biggest sign that something great is about to happen. We can't always tell when God is preparing us for something greater. In the midst of chaos, loss, and uncertainty, our vision becomes limited. We focus on what was out of our control, what was taken away, the doors that were closed. But God, who sees far beyond, never allows something to go away without there being a purpose. He never closes a door without already having another, much bigger and better, waiting to be opened. The problem is that often we are so attached to what is gone that we cannot see what He is preparing. There are clear signs that God is shaping you, signs that He is preparing you for a new level. And one of the most obvious is the loss of things you considered safe. God always works with purpose, and when He wants to lead you to something greater, He needs to first remove what may be stopping you from growing. Maybe it was a job where you were comfortable, but that didn't allow you to evolve. Perhaps it is a relationship that in your eyes seemed good, but that was not part of the plans that God has for your life. Maybe it's a cycle of friendships that, as much as they seem to support you, were actually taking you away from the purpose that God wants to fulfill. When God begins to act, He allows certain things to fall apart. It allows doors to close, previously accessible paths to become unreachable, and situations that seemed safe to simply break down. And when this happens, our first reaction is usually to resist. We try to hold on to what God is already removing. We fight against changes. We insist on remaining where we should no longer be. But God does not work within our comfort zone. If He is taking something away, it is because He has something much greater prepared. Another clear sign that God is shaping you for something greater is separation from people who were not part of your purpose. Not everyone who starts the journey with you should stay until the end. Some people were placed in your life for a specific time, but not forever. And God, in His wisdom, knows who needs to remain by your side and who needs to leave for you to grow. When God begins to act, He pushes certain people away, not because you should hate or despise them, but because He knows they won't be able to walk with you to the next level. Sometimes separation hurts. You don't understand why some friendships have cooled, why some relationships have broken, why certain connections that seemed so strong suddenly no longer make sense. But if you look back, you'll realize that many of the biggest changes in your life happened after God removed someone from your path. And not because this person was bad, but because their cycle in your life had ended. God also teaches you to depend more on Him than on your own plans. This is one of the most challenging signs because it requires total surrender. You may have made plans, set goals, organized everything the way you thought was right, but suddenly everything gets out of control. Nothing happens as you expected. Doors that seemed right close, paths that seemed safe become uncertain. And at that moment, you find yourself with no alternative but to trust God. Puts you in situations where the only way out is to depend completely on Him, because He wants you to understand that your security is not in what you plan, but in what He has already determined. Many give up at this point. They think that God is against them, that everything is going wrong. But really, God is just realigning your heart, teaching you to trust. And trust means to keep walking, even without seeing the complete path. It means believing that, even without understanding, God is in control. It means waiting, even when everything seems stopped, because God's silence is never inactivity. He's always doing something behind the scenes. And the most incredible thing about all of this is that God never closes a door without having another, much bigger one, waiting to be opened. This is a truth we see repeatedly in the Bible. When God took Joseph from his family and allowed him to be sold into slavery, it seemed like the end. But in fact, God was opening the way for him to reach Egypt and, years later, become governor. When God took Moses out of the palace and led him into the desert, it seemed like a failure. But in fact, He was preparing the liberator of Israel. When God allowed David to flee to caves, hiding from Saul, it seemed unfair, but He was training a king. And now look at your life. Is God closing some doors because He has something much bigger prepared for you? Are you stuck in the past, not realizing that your greatest blessing lies in what is yet to come? Now I want to hear from you. Has God ever closed a door in your life? and then you realized it went to something much better? Have you ever thought you had lost everything, but then you understood that God was leading you to a greater purpose? Share in the comments. Your testimony could be the answer someone needs to continue believing. And before continuing, I need to ask you something very important. If this message is speaking to you, if you believe that more people need to understand this truth, then like this video and subscribe to the channel right now. This isn't just a request, it's a way to spread this message to those who need to hear it. The world needs to know that God never closes a door without first preparing a much bigger one. Now, stick with me, because what comes next could completely change your outlook on life's difficult moments. You will understand how what seems like a loss can actually be the greatest proof that God already has something incredible in store for you. The turning point happens when God decides to act. And when He acts, everything changes in an unexpected way, in a way that no one could predict. Things that seemed lost begin to align. Doors that were locked suddenly open. Opportunities arise where before there was only despair. But this change does not happen without purpose. God does not simply take you out of the desert without first transforming you, without first breaking what cannot be taken to the next level. He never restores something without first shaping, correcting, and teaching. And that's why many people go through what we call a process. God's process can seem painful because He isn't just fixing something on the surface. He is rebuilding from the ground up. He is tearing away everything that once served you, but that can no longer accompany you in the new time that He has prepared. God does not allow you to carry unnecessary weights, to maintain connections that no longer make sense, to remain in places where your purpose cannot grow. And for that, He often needs to break. He needs to expose what is hidden, remove what should have already been left behind. And when that moment arrives, when God decides to transform your life, nothing can stop it. The history of the Bible is full of testimonies of people who went through the process of loss, silence, waiting, but who then saw the glory of God in an extraordinary way. Think about Joseph. For years he suffered unjustly. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, imprisoned for no reason. All this time, it seemed like God was distant, but the truth was that God was just setting the stage for the big turning point. When the time finally came, Joseph was taken from prison and brought before Pharaoh, and in a matter of hours, he went from prisoner to governor of Egypt. What seemed like the end was, in fact, the beginning of the biggest phase of his life. The same thing happened to Job. He lost everything, went through pain that no one could imagine. But when the turning point arrived, God restored his life in a way that surpassed anything he had before. God didn't just give back, He gave double. This shows us something powerful. God never restores in the same measure. He always gives us more than what we had before. He enlarges, He multiplies, He honors those who remain faithful in the process. And how often do we see this happen these days? People who lost everything, and when they thought there was no way out, saw God act in a surprising way. Someone who was fired from a job and thought it was the end, but then received a much greater opportunity that brought not only provision, but also purpose. People who have gone through betrayal, abandonment, painful separations, but who, instead of destroying themselves, found in God the strength to start over. And today they live something infinitely better than they could have imagined. What do these stories show us? That the process can be painful, but the reward always arrives. God never takes you to the valley without having already prepared the mountain on the other side. He never allows you to face the storm without already setting aside a rainbow of promises to remind you that He is faithful. But to reach that turning point, you need to remain firm. Many people give up before the answer arrives. They look at the pain, at the time that is passing, at the difficulties, and think that God has forgotten them. But God is never late. He has an exact time to act, and when that time comes, there is no one who can stop Him. Now I ask you, have you ever lived through a moment like this? Have you ever had a phase in your life when you thought everything was lost, but then you saw God completely transform your story? If so, share your testimony in the comments. Your experience may be exactly what someone needs to hear to keep believing. And before we continue, I need to ask you something very important. If this message is speaking to you, if you believe that more people need to understand this truth, then like this video and subscribe to the channel right now. This isn't just a click, it's a way to spread this message to whoever needs to hear it. The world needs to know that God never closes a door without first preparing a much bigger one. Now stick with me, because what comes next could completely change your outlook on life's difficult moments. You will understand how what seems like a loss can actually be the greatest proof that God already has something incredible in store for you. If you feel like you've lost everything, maybe God is just taking you to a higher level. I know this phrase may seem difficult to accept in the midst of pain, in the midst of losses, in the midst of uncertainty. But stop for a moment and reflect. Do you think God would allow something to be ripped out of your life without a purpose? Do you think that He, who formed you, who knows you better than you know yourself, would simply let you face all of this without a greater reason? When we look at the history of great men and women of faith, we realize that each of them went through a period of loss, trials, and desert before experiencing the fulfillment of God's promises. Job lost everything he had and was restored twice as much. Joseph was betrayed, sold, imprisoned before becoming governor of Egypt. David was anointed king, but spent years running from Saul before taking the throne. God always uses the most difficult moments in life to prepare us for something greater. But the problem is that in the middle of the process, we often fail to see this. We are so focused on the pain that we don't realize that God is already moving the pieces, is already organizing everything for the turning point. Maybe now you are feeling that God is silent, that He is not listening to you. Maybe you're looking around and seeing people thriving while you struggle. Maybe you're wondering if it's worth continuing to believe. But God wants to remind you of something today. His silence never means inactivity. What He promised will be fulfilled, but at the right time. The book of Habakkuk gives us a powerful answer to these moments of waiting. For the vision is yet for the appointed time, but it hastens to the end and will not deceive. If it delays, wait for it will certainly come. It will not delay. This verse teaches us that God has perfect timing. He doesn't rush, He doesn't delay. He knows the exact moment when each promise must be fulfilled. But while that moment doesn't come, He prepares us, He shapes us, He strengthens us. God never delivers something great to someone who is not ready to carry it. The desert is a learning phase, and what you are going through now may be exactly the training you need to live what God has already reserved for you. Now stop and think, what could God be teaching you right now? Is He showing you that you need to trust Him more? Is He teaching you to depend less on your own plans and more on His will? Is He preparing you for something so big that if you received it now, you wouldn't be ready to handle it? God doesn't throw anyone into their purpose without first preparing them. He does not place you in the promise without first shaping your character, strengthening your faith, teaching you to depend on Him. And maybe you are living exactly that moment right now. You feel like you've lost everything, but God is just repositioning you. You feel like everything has fallen apart, but God is just rebuilding it in a firmer, stronger, more structured way. What seemed like stability may have just been a weak foundation, and God needed to tear it down to build something solid. And now, I want to ask you, have you ever been through a moment like this? Have you ever lived through a period where you thought you had lost everything, but then realized that God was preparing you for something much bigger? If so, share your testimony in the comments. Your story may be just what someone needs to hear to keep believing. And before we continue, I need to ask you something very important. If this message is speaking to you, if you believe that more people need to understand this truth, then like this video, and subscribe to the channel right now. This isn't just a click, it's a way to spread this message to whoever needs to hear it. The world needs to know that God never closes a door without first preparing a much bigger one. Now, stick with me, because what comes next could completely change your outlook on life's difficult moments. You will understand how what seems like a loss can actually be the greatest proof that God already has something incredible in store for you. If this message touched your life, if God spoke to you through this video, I invite you to be part of this journey of faith. Subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any words that can strengthen your journey. Here, you will never be alone. If God has brought you here, it is because He wants to remind you that the process is not the end. It is the beginning of something bigger. And if you watched until the end, I want you to comment, "I trust in God's timing and wait for His will." Declare this in the comments, because this is a way of prophesying about your life. Many people need to know this truth, and when you comment, you also help this message reach more lives that need to hear it today. Like this video, share it with someone who needs this word. And remain firm, because God never abandons those who wait on Him. Now that you understand that losses are part of God's process for something greater, I want to show you something even deeper. There is a secret that many people don't realize about how God turns pain into purpose, something that can completely change the way you face life's challenges. In the next video, you will discover why some answers from God take longer than we expect, and how to act until the promise arrives. This knowledge may be what you need to live what God has already prepared. Your journey continues.